The stories we tell ourselves about violence matter. I want you to do a little thought experiment with me, if you will. I want you to imagine a newspaper headline that reads, "Violence against children in schools harms kids." Now, what do you think about when you read that article? Do you imagine kids on a playground in a bloody fight? Do you imagine a very clear perpetrator and a very clear victim? Human relationships are so much more complex than that. And the intricacies of interpersonal relationships are far more nuanced than that precludes or foretells. The other day I was walking with my 11-year-old daughter. She goes to school in a Canadian city, and she was starting to share with me her experience and what she had witnessed within her school of the interrelationships between children. She told me about mean girls, how girls treated each other quite poorly. She told me about the in-group and the out-group and how people were ostracized in different ways. She also shared with me her insights into the differing ways that boys and girls navigated violence. She talked about boys doing things much more acutely and in the moment and then letting them go. And she talked about the kinds of abuses that girls cause to one another of being much more nuanced, but much more lasting in the pain that they caused. It was so interesting to me to listen to her experiences because they so clearly mirrored the findings from this research that we did, the regional research on violence against children in schools in Southeast Europe. But it also made me reflect on my own experience as a child. So when I was about the same age as my daughter, 11 years old, I was in school, I was in music class, and had you asked me beforehand, had I ever experienced violence in schools? And I probably, earlier in my career, would have said no, but I know better now. But one experience that I want to share with you was in music class. We were playing on the recorders a song, "Ben" by Michael Jackson. Ironically, it's a song about ostracism and about feeling quite lonely. But in that moment, the boy behind me was teasing me. He was pulling my hair and he kept kicking me, and I kept asking him to stop, and I kept asking him to stop, and he wouldn't. He just kept pulling my hair. And I got angrier and angrier and angrier, and at one moment I just burst. I rammed my chair back into his knees as hard as I could, and he yelped in pain, and understandably, the two of us were sent to the principal's office. Now, this was a first for me, and the only time I was ever sent to the principal's office. I was feeling so ashamed of what I had done, and as we sat there waiting to talk to the principal, we both had our heads hung low. And I shared my story with the principal of what had happened, and the boy shared his story of what had happened. And understandably, the principal looked at me, told me to think about what I had done, asked me to apologize, which I did, and then he told me to go back to class, which I did. I was so relieved at this point that I hadn't gotten in more trouble than that, and it was even more alarming to me that the boy didn't come back to class. And as it turned out, he'd actually been expelled for this same incident. Now, I felt confused by this. I was the one who had caused pain. But what I didn't tell you about the story is I lived in a place within the Canadian context where racism was rampant. And I was a white girl, he was a black boy. Looking back on that, there are so many levels of violence that we can unpack. And as I've become an adult, I've learned to explore the different nuances of violence and to look at that in a different kind of way. I've learned that intellectual curiosity is a core area that we need to bring in to actually move forward. And I've also seen that a commitment to change is also necessary for propelling us forward into a different discussion. Advance forward several decades, and I was feeling very privileged to be invited to join this group of researchers to do this research on violence against children in schools in Southeast Europe. With colleagues from across Canada, from the International Institute of Child Rights and Development, working in partnership with Terres de Homes and the Child Protection Hub of Southeast Europe, and these amazing researchers from 8 different countries across South and East Europe. We were able to explore the crazy place that is a school. If you think about a school as a crazy place, you take all of these children or young people and you throw them into an intense experience where they have to navigate social interaction while they're developing. Ideally, they are places where we can learn to grow, and they are given some space to make mistakes and to grow and learn how to manage those relationships. That's not always the case. And in this research, we wanted to know a little bit more about what was happening for young people. So we asked the core question of what do we know about the incidents and type of violence that children and young people are facing in and around school in Southeast Europe, as well as the children and young people that are most impacted by it. We also wanted to know a little bit about the social and gender norms that propagated violence against children. In addition, we wanted to ask children and young people what were their experiences of the support systems that were there. And we wanted to know what mechanisms, formal and informal, were supporting them, and how they felt they could actually intervene and support themselves within their experiences of violence. Of course, during our research, COVID-19 struck, so we had to make some adaptations as we went, but we also wanted to know how did COVID-19 impact their experience of violence in schools. So this was a qualitative research project. We drew on participatory research methods across the 8 countries of Albania, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Bulgaria, Croatia, Kosovo, Moldova, Romania, and Serbia. We had national researchers. They chose 2 sites within their country where they did research with a group of up to 15 young people, aged 13 to 18, and additional up to 15 adults who were supporters, either parents or teachers or principals or other individuals working within the community. Now, we used a range of participatory action research tools. We used social mapping and vignettes and participatory ranking, social network mapping, and focus groups. We held workshops over 2 to 3 days, depending on the country. To ensure that we were having some consistency across those 8 countries, the international team, largely led by the International Institute of Child Rights and Development, worked with the national researchers to ensure that they understood the tools, had a same approach to using them, and also worked with the analysis in a similar way. So at the national level, the national researchers conducted the research, they analyzed it using consistent forms, and they wrote up national reports. The national reports were sent to the international team. We did a further analysis across the 8 countries and synthesized that into a final report, which you have access to. Now, we also wanted to know about social and gender norms. So what do I mean by social norms? Well, norms are those unwritten rules of behavior that drive our attitudes, our actions, and our values. And they're really important because they influence us in quite direct and indirect ways on how we explore violence. And we wanted to know more about that. So what did we find in our research? We found so much. It was such a rich set of findings. Overall, we found that violence was common, all kinds of violence. Children and young people were experiencing violence on a daily basis. They were sometimes experiencing it acutely, but for shorter periods of time. Almost every kind of violence you could think of was experienced: psychological, emotional, physical, sexual. It happened in the schools, it happened on the way to schools, it happened online. And the perpetrators were just as diverse. Largely, they were peers, but they also included teachers, parents, individuals that they encountered on their way to school. Overall, what we found was violence is common. It's diffuse. We also found that it's gendered. The experiences of boys and girls were quite different. We found that it was largely underestimated. And importantly, we found that violence was tolerated. And that's an area I think we need to focus on. We also found that the circle of protection that children and young people talked about was quite small and close to them. Now, that varied across different countries, but overall, it was quite small, and the level of distrust that children and young people talked about was important. They distrusted those actors that should be there to support them, particularly police, but other public institutions, and sadly, sometimes the educational system and the teachers. One of the things that was quite good to hear was that children and young people were quite aware of the long-lasting impact of psychological violence. They knew that this was just as, if not more, impactful than physical violence. And that's important because the most common kind of violence reported by children and young people was, in fact, that psychological violence or bullying. One of the most disturbing things that I heard within the research was quite a number of people saying that violence was inevitable, that it was immutable, and that there was nothing we could do about it. And that's where I think we need to really focus our efforts. One of the other things that we found in the research was a whole constellation of social norms that limited the reporting of violence, that increased the use of violence, that increased the acceptance of violence, and it limited the interventions of third parties. So together, the stories that perpetuate these social norms and gendered norms are really important for us to explore and challenge. One young person in Albania said, "The old generation cannot change. Our generation needs to." That's a story worth perpetuating. It's interesting, in preparing for this talk, I looked for quotes on violence. And what I found was that the ones that were most relevant to this research were all created by science fiction writers. Such an odd finding. But what that tells me is that there's stories that we need to get past. We need to move beyond, to imagine a world different than what we have now, to understand that violence is not immutable. We can make a difference. So in thinking of imagining a new system, there are a couple things that I think we can do. Going back to the research, the young people did not see themselves as agents in change. So I think this is an important finding to hold on to. Legris and Sislagi in 2019 wrote a paper where they suggested there were 5 areas where we could influence and change social norms. They talked about correcting the misperceptions, making structural change, intervening in legal norms, supporting role models, and challenging power dynamics. Of those 5, I think there's 3 that we can really focus on correcting misperceptions, on challenging power dynamics, and in supporting role models. So I think there's 3 things that we can really focus on. 1, notice and reflect. Go back to my 11-year-old daughter. I encourage her to continue to notice and reflect on what she sees around her and the ways in which we can better articulate our feelings for others and navigate those complex interpersonal relationships. 2, I think we need to listen and learn. Children and young people are such good spaces or places for us to better understand their experience. They're experts in their own lives. One young person from Serbia suggested that maybe someday we'll be able to change something, but not now. Who will take us seriously, especially a city 8th grade girl? I notice. I've heard her. And I think it's really important that we continue to listen to their experiences and learn from them, learn ways that we can actually intervene and make change, while also encouraging children and young people to get the help and support that they need. The last thing, and importantly, that I think we need to do is to change the stories that we tell ourselves. Violence is not inevitable. It is not immutable. We can change the narrative around violence in schools experienced by children and young people. Going back to my science fiction writers, Isaac Asimov says that nonviolence doesn't always work, but violence never does. And what I encourage you to do as you listen to this talks today is to think about the narratives where you can make a change and explore the concept that violence is not inevitable. Thank you very much.